All right, buckle up because today we're taking a deep dive into some pretty wild territory.
We're talking about two sources that, at first glance, might seem like they're from totally different universes.
On the one hand, we've got Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is basically the granddaddy of modern economics.
It lays out all the rules of the game for how societies create wealth, trade with each other, all that jazz.
But then on the other hand, we're also diving into The Law of One, which is, well, it's a whole different vibe.
It's this fascinating exploration of consciousness, different dimensions of reality, the evolution of souls, even this concept of a harvest of souls moving to a higher level of being.
I mean, you've got the down-to-earth practicality of economics, and then the mind-bending concepts of, like, universal consciousness and cosmic evolution.
So what we're going to do is kind of hold these two seemingly opposite frameworks up to each other and see what happens.
Do we find any surprising connections? Do they completely clash? Our mission is to see what kind of insights emerge when we look at the world through these two radically different lenses.
Think of it like a mental mashup, where we're not trying to prove one right or wrong, but rather to gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the forces at play in our world, both the ones we can see and the ones we can't.
All right, so let's jump right into it. The wealth of nations. One of the things that struck me was how Smith tackled this very basic question. How did people even trade before money existed?
Yeah, it's so easy to take money for granted. We just whip out our cards or phones and boom, transaction done.
But before all that, it must have been a total nightmare trying to swap one thing for another.
Exactly. Smith lays out this problem so clearly. Imagine a world without money. You're a butcher, right?
Okay, I'm a butcher, got my cleaver, my apron, and a whole lot of meat.
And you need bread and beer, simple enough. But what if the baker and the brewer don't need any meat at that moment?
Oh, I see where you're going with this. It's like a giant game of barter Tetris, trying to find the perfect match of wants and needs.
Exactly. Economists actually have a fancy term for this, the double coincidence of wants. It means both parties need what the other has at the exact same time for the exchange to work.
So if you're the butcher, swimming in sausages, but everyone else is craving eggs or shoes, your sausage-based economy kind of falls apart.
Pretty much. But of course, humans are ingenious, especially when it comes to getting what they need.
So how do they solve this problem? Did they just walk around with massive shopping lists, hoping to bump into the right person?
Well, Smith dives into this fascinating history of early forms of currency, and it's way more diverse than you might think.
Yeah, I remember reading about things like cattle, salt, and shells being used as money.
You got it. Cattle were a big one in ancient times. I mean, even Homer in the Iliad valued Diomede's armor at 9 oxen.
9 oxen. That's like a warrior's retirement plan right there.
And then you've got salt in places like Abyssinia, certain types of shells in parts of India, dried cod in Newfoundland, tobacco in Virginia, sugar in the West Indies. It's pretty wild.
Talk about carrying your wallet around. Can you imagine lugging a cow to the market to buy some bread?
Yeah, not very practical. And speaking of impractical, Smith even mentions this village in Scotland where they used nails as money.
Nails? Seriously, that sounds like something out of a fairy tale.
I know, right? But it actually happened. Workmen would use nails to pay for things at the local shops. It just goes to show you that people will find a way to make trade happen, even if the currency seems a bit out there.
It's a testament to that fundamental human drive to exchange value, to connect with each other through commerce.
That's what Smith was getting at. He called it the power of exchanging, and he saw it as the foundation of a thriving society.
So it wasn't just about the stuff being traded, it was about the act of exchange itself, the connections it created.
Right. And money, even with all its flaws, was this incredibly powerful tool that enabled that exchange to happen more smoothly and efficiently. It's like the oil that keeps the engine of commerce running.
Makes you appreciate the little coins jingling in your pocket a bit more, huh? But money itself hasn't always been this stable, reliable thing we know today.
Oh, absolutely not. Smith goes deep into the history of coinage, and it's full of ups and downs, manipulations, and even outright deceptions.
Yeah, I remember reading about how rulers would debase the coinage, like sneaking in less silver or gold while keeping the face value the same.
Right, they try to pull a fast one on people, especially to deal with debts. Smith talks about how the Roman, as for example, was gradually reduced to a tiny fraction of its original metal content.
Wow, so like a coin that was once a solid piece of silver would eventually become like silver-plated copper or something?
Pretty much. And it wasn't just the Romans, the English, Scottish, and French, Pounds and pennies all went through similar periods of debasement over the centuries.
So it's like trying to measure something with a ruler that keeps shrinking. Talk about economic chaos.
It caused a lot of problems. Smith saw it as a major betrayal of trust because it basically meant that the money people had saved wasn't worth what they thought it was.
Makes sense. It's like finding out that your gold bar is actually filled with lead.
Exactly. And it created huge instability because people lost faith in the currency. They didn't know what anything was really worth anymore.
This whole issue of the real value of things is fascinating. Smith makes this key distinction between nominal price and real price.
Oh, yeah, that's a crucial concept. Nominal price is basically the price tag you see in the market, the number on the sticker.
But real price is something different.
Right. Smith defines real price as the power of a commodity to command the labor of others. It's about how much human effort is actually represented by that good or service.
So a silver coin might buy you a loaf of bread today, but its real value is tied to how many hours of work it took to mine that silver, bake that bread, and so on.
Exactly. The nominal price can fluctuate a lot due to supply and demand, inflation, all those things. But the real price is more about the underlying intrinsic value of something.
And Smith suggests using corn prices as a more stable way to track real value over time. Why corn, specifically?
He chose corn because it's such a fundamental foodstuff. Its value is tied to basic human needs, the effort required to grow it, and it tends to be more stable than, say, precious metals, which can be influenced by all sorts of market speculation.
So it's like the bedrock of the economy. If corn prices are going crazy, you know something's seriously out of whack.
Yeah, it's a good barometer for the overall health of the economy. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about another key idea from The Wealth of Nations, the division of labor and specialization.
This is where Smith really starts to break down how societies become more productive, right?
Absolutely. He famously uses this example of a pin factory. Imagine one person trying to make a whole pin from start to finish. It's a complex process with lots of different steps.
Yeah, you got to draw the wire, cut it, sharpen it, shape the head, and so on. It'd take forever for one person to make even a handful of pins.
Right. But what if you break down that whole process into a bunch of specialized tasks?
So you have one person just drawing the wire, another cutting it, another sharpening it, and so on.
Exactly. And what Smith realized was that this division of labor leads to a massive increase in productivity. When everyone focuses on their specialized task, they become super efficient at it.
It's like that saying, jack of all trades, master of none. If you try to do everything, you're probably not going to be very good at anything.
That's the idea. But if you become a master of one tiny piece of the puzzle, the collective output of the group goes through the roof.
It's fascinating how this seemingly simple idea, breaking down work into smaller chunks, can have such a huge impact.
It's all about maximizing efficiency through specialization. And in a very basic pre-capitalist setup, Smith says the worker who makes something owns the entire product.
So if I make a chair from scratch, that chair is mine, and I can sell it or trade it however I want.
Right. But as soon as people start accumulating stock, which is essentially capital, things get a bit more complex.
Because now you have employers who are providing the materials, the tools, and the wages for the workers. They're investing their capital with the goal of making a profit.
Exactly. And this is where the value created by the worker gets split. Part of it goes to the worker as wages, and the rest goes to the employer as profit, who's taking on the risk.
So it creates this dynamic where the worker is contributing their labor, but the employer is also contributing their capital and their entrepreneurial skills.
And Smith saw this as a necessary part of economic growth. He believed that the pursuit of profit by employers within a free market would ultimately lead to greater wealth and prosperity for everyone.
It's that invisible hand idea, right? Where individuals acting in their own self-interest end up benefiting society as a whole.
That's the one. Now, Smith also talks about how the price we see in the market tends to gravitate towards this thing he calls the natural price.
What's the natural price exactly? Is it like some kind of cosmically determined value for things?
Not exactly cosmic, but it is about the underlying cost of producing something. The natural price includes the rent for the land used to produce it, the wages paid to the workers, and the profit needed to compensate the employer for their investment.
So it's like the base cost of bringing that product to market.
But the actual price we see in the market, what people are willing to pay, is what he calls the market price. And that can fluctuate all over the place depending on supply and demand.
So if everyone suddenly wants the same thing, the price goes up. And if there's a surplus, the price goes down.
Exactly. But Smith believed that in a free market, without any interference, The market price would always tend to move towards that natural price. It's
Yeah.
like there's this invisible force pulling them together.
But of course, there are always things that disrupt that perfect equilibrium, right? Like
Right.
monopolies, sudden changes in consumer preferences, or government
Yeah.
regulations.
Those things can mess with the market and keep prices artificially high or low for extended periods. But Smith's main point was that the free market, with its inherent self-correcting mechanisms, was the most efficient way to allocate resources and create wealth.
Okay, so that's a taste of the wealth of nations and its focus on the material world of economics. Now let's take a giant leap into the more metaphysical realm with the law of one. And a good place to start is with this concept of the harvest and planetary vibration.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting, where we start to look at the world through a completely different lens.
So the law of one describes this idea of consciousness evolving through a series of densities, right?
That's right. It's like climbing a ladder, with each rung representing a different level of consciousness.
And the harvest is like graduation day. You move on to the next level if you've met certain criteria.
Yeah, it's this point in a planet's cycle where beings have the opportunity to transition to a higher density of consciousness. And the main factor that determines whether you're ready to graduate, so to speak, is your orientation towards service to others or service to self.
So it's not about how much money you've made or how many possessions you have, but rather about your ethical and spiritual development.
That's the key difference here. The wealth of nations is all about material wealth, while the law of one is about spiritual evolution.
And what about this planetary vibration? It sounds kind of new agey, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Think of it like the collective energy field of the planet. It's influenced by the thoughts, emotions, and actions of everyone living here.
So if a lot of people are feeling angry, fearful, or selfish, that drags down the planetary vibration. And if people are feeling loving, compassionate, and joyful, that lifts it up.
Exactly. And according to the law of one, a higher, more harmonious planetary vibration makes it easier for individuals to achieve the spiritual growth needed for the harvest. It's like the planet itself is evolving alongside its inhabitants.
And this brings us to the concept of wanderers.
Mhm.
Who are these wanderers and what's their role in all of this?
Wanderers are essentially souls from higher densities who've chosen to incarnate on Earth to help us out with this whole harvest thing.
So they're like spiritual volunteers coming from a more advanced realm to lend a hand.
Pretty much. They're mainly from the sixth density, which is a pretty high level of consciousness.
And they come here to help raise the planetary vibration and make it easier for us Earthlings to evolve.
That's the idea. They incarnate here with the specific intention of spreading love, light, and wisdom to help us shift towards a more service to others orientation.
That's amazing. And the law of one suggests there are millions of them here right now, walking among us.
65 million to be exact. It's wild to think that there might be that many highly evolved souls living seemingly ordinary lives all around us.
It's a cool contrast to Smith's ideas about population changes being driven purely by economic factors. Here we have this concept of souls being drawn to Earth for a spiritual purpose to help with this grand evolutionary event.
It really highlights the different assumptions at play here. Smith is looking at the world through a very materialist lens, while the law of one introduces this whole other dimension of spiritual purpose and cosmic evolution.
So let's dive deeper into those different motivations. The law of one talks about this core distinction between service to self and service to others.
Yeah, this is a fundamental concept in their framework. It's basically about choosing which path you want to follow on your spiritual journey.
So service to self is all about putting your own needs and desires first, while service to others is about focusing on compassion, unity, and the well-being of everyone.
Exactly. And this choice, this orientation, is what ultimately determines whether you're ready for the harvest.
If you're primarily focused on yourself, you're not going to be vibrating at the same frequency as those who are focused on love and unity. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Right. And the law of one even mentions that during a previous harvest cycle, some beings who were ready to move on to fourth density chose to stay behind in third density out of service to others.
Wow, so they voluntarily delayed their own spiritual advancement to help those who weren't quite ready yet.
Right.
That's some serious dedication.
It is. And now there's this big push, guided by the law of one, to facilitate a significant harvest at the end of this current cycle, which is said to be about 75,000 years long.
So it's like a cosmic deadline. Time to figure out which path you're on and make sure you're vibrating at the right frequency.
It's more like an opportunity than a deadline. And the law of one suggests that the best way to prepare for this harvest is to look inward, to seek the heart of self.
What does that mean, seeking the heart of self? Is it like meditation or introspection?
It's about understanding, experiencing, accepting, and ultimately merging with your true self, your essence. And then extending that understanding and acceptance to others and to the Creator, recognizing the underlying unity of all things.
It's a journey of self-discovery and spiritual awakening, a process of aligning your thoughts, feelings, and actions with your chosen path of service.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with the primary driver in the wealth of nations, which is self-interest and the pursuit of material profit.
It's a pretty stark contrast. One is about looking inward and focusing on spiritual growth, while the other is about looking outward and focusing on material accumulation.
And yet, both systems have their own logic and their own way of explaining the world. The law of one sees the harvest as the ultimate goal of evolution, while Smith sees the creation of wealth as the engine of progress.
It's fascinating to consider these two perspectives side by side. Now, the law of one also talks about these beings called guardians who protect our free will.
Yeah, the guardians are like cosmic overseers, making sure that the game of life is played fairly.
So they're protecting us from outside interference that might manipulate our choices and prevent us from exercising our free will.
Exactly. They're safeguarding the integrity of the third density experience, making sure that we have the freedom to choose our own paths without excessive meddling.
But then you also have the Orion group, which is described as having a service to self-orientation and trying to interfere with our free will.
Right. The Orion group, according to the law of one, seeks to manipulate and control others for their own gain.
So it's like a cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, with Earth as the battleground.
In a way, yes. But the Guardians don't completely block the Orion group's actions because that would violate their free will as well.
So it's a balancing act. The Orion group is allowed to try to influence us, but within certain limits.
Right. And we, as third density beings, still have the ultimate choice of whether to succumb to their manipulations or to follow our own paths.
It's like having a cosmic safety net, but we still have to do the hard work of discerning truth from falsehood and making our own choices.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears again and talk about the evolution of consciousness itself. The law of one suggests that eventually every being will experience every density as part of this grand journey back to the one infinite being.
It's like we're all on a cosmic road trip and we're going to hit every stop along the way, eventually returning to the source.
That's the idea. It's a journey of remembering who we truly are, shedding the illusions of separation, and reuniting with the Creator.
And we're currently in third density, which followed a transition from second density. Do we know anything about the time frame for that shift?
The law of one gives an approximate time frame of about 3,350 Earth years for that transition from second to third density. It wasn't an overnight thing.
So it was a gradual process, kind of like the evolution of species on Earth, where small changes accumulate over long periods.
And what about the transition from third to fourth density, which is what a lot of people are curious about these days?
Yeah, is there a cosmic timetable for that, like a date we should mark on our calendars?
Unfortunately, not really. Ross says that predicting this transition is tricky due to certain uncharacteristic anomalies and the current state of our planetary consciousness, which they describe as being a bit messy and chaotic.
So it's less of a fixed schedule and more of an ongoing process that's influenced by our collective choices and actions.
Exactly. There's no set date, but the window of possibility seems to be somewhere between 100 and 700 years from now. But even that range is subject to change.
So we've got some time to figure things out, but it's definitely not an excuse to procrastinate on our spiritual evolution.
Right. The journey is happening whether we're consciously participating or not. All right, let's jump back to the wealth of nations for a bit and explore another fascinating idea that Smith brings up, the role of money in the economy.
He makes this seemingly counterintuitive claim that money is the only part of circulating capital that can actually reduce net revenue. How does that even make sense?
It might seem weird at first, but think about it this way. Money itself doesn't produce anything. It's a tool, a medium of exchange, but it's not directly involved in creating goods or services.
So if you have a bunch of gold coins sitting in a vault, they're not doing any work, they're not generating any new wealth.
Right. Smith compares money to fixed capital like machines. Both require an initial investment to acquire and ongoing costs to maintain. And those expenses are deductions from the net revenue of a society.
So even though money is essential for facilitating trade and enabling the circulation of wealth, The actual gold and silver tied up in coins could potentially have been used for other, more directly productive purposes.
Exactly. It's a necessary cost of doing business, but it's not directly creating new value in the same way that, say, building a factory or planting crops
It's
does.
like the oil that lubricates the engine, but it's not the fuel that powers it.
Perfect analogy. Okay, let's talk about banking and credit, which are obviously crucial parts of any modern economy. Smith was a big fan of the Scottish banking system and their careful approach to issuing paper money.
What was it about their methods that he found so admirable?
Smith was impressed by their prudence and their focus on ensuring that the amount of paper money they put into circulation didn't exceed the amount of gold and silver that would have otherwise been in use. They were basically making sure that their paper money was backed by real economic activity.
So they weren't just printing money out of thin air and creating inflation. They were making sure that each banknote represented real value, real goods and services that were being produced and exchanged.
Right. And they did this by closely monitoring whether their customers were repaying their loans on time.
Mm.
If people were consistently repaying their debts, it indicated that the loans weren't excessive and that the economy was healthy.
It sounds like a system built on trust and a deep understanding of how credit can be both a powerful tool for growth and a potential source of instability if it's not managed responsibly.
Exactly. Smith recognized both the benefits and the dangers of paper money, and he saw the Scottish system as a model for how to strike that balance effectively.
Now, Smith also draws a distinction between productive and unproductive labor, which might sound a bit judgmental, but it's actually about the different ways that labor contributes to the overall economy.
Right. Productive labor, in Smith's view, is any labor that adds value to a tangible good. So a factory worker, a farmer, a carpenter, they're all engaged in productive labor.
They're creating something new, something that can be sold or traded and that contributes to the overall wealth of society.
Exactly. And the capital invested in employing productive labor is expected to be recovered with a profit. Unproductive labor, on the other hand, is labor that doesn't result in a physical product.
So things like services, professions like doctors, lawyers, teachers, they fall into the unproductive category.
Right. Now, it's important to note that Smith wasn't saying that these professions were useless or unimportant,
He recognized that they were valuable and necessary for a functioning society.
but he was making a distinction based on their direct contribution to the creation of material wealth. Productive labor creates tangible goods, while unproductive labor consumes wealth.
It's like the difference between planting a tree that will bear fruit and hiring someone to sing you a song. Both have value, but only one directly contributes to the material abundance of society.
That's a good way to put it. Now, another key element of Smith's analysis is the relationship between town and country, which he saw as the foundation of a prosperous society.
He describes this as a symbiotic relationship, right, where the countryside provides food and raw materials, and the towns provide manufactured goods.
Exactly. And this exchange is mutually beneficial. Both sides gain from the specialization and the increased efficiency that comes with it.
It's like a giant marketplace, where each region is contributing its unique strengths and talents.
And the proximity of a town is super important for farmers because it gives them a readily available market for their surplus produce.
They don't have to transport their goods long distances, and they have a more diverse customer base.
Smith even observed how land located near a town tends to be cultivated more intensively because of this easy access to market. It just makes good economic sense.
Now, if a country is looking to invest its capital, Smith proposes a natural order of preference, starting with agriculture, then manufacturing, then foreign commerce.
He saw agriculture as the most fundamental and essential economic activity because it provides the basic necessities for survival.
Food, shelter, clothing, all those things come from agriculture.
And then, as a society becomes more developed and its agricultural needs are met, capital will naturally flow into manufacturing to process those raw materials and create more complex goods.
And finally, you have foreign commerce, which is about trading those surplus goods with other nations.
It's like a natural progression from the most basic needs to the more complex and specialized activities of a mature economy.
And he makes the point that even if foreign capital is used to export a country's raw materials, it can still be beneficial if domestic capital is limited.
Right, because it allows the country to focus its own resources on more immediately productive activities at home.
So it's not always bad to rely on foreign investment, as long as it's done strategically and doesn't undermine the long-term growth of the domestic economy.
Exactly. Now, Smith also discusses the historical transitions from serfdom to more independent forms of land ownership and how those changes affected agricultural output.
He talks about how systems where landlords take a large share of the produce, like sharecropping, can discourage cultivators from making improvements.
Because they're not fully benefiting from their own efforts. If most of the extra crops they grow go to the landlord, there's less incentive to work harder or to invest in new techniques.
Makes sense. It's all about aligning incentives. If you want people to be productive, you need to give them a reason to invest their time and effort.
Exactly. Smith believed that systems where farmers had more secure rights and a greater share of the profits led to more investment and higher productivity.
Now, another interesting aspect of the wealth of nations is Smith's analysis of the historical power of large landowners and how their economic dominance often translated into political influence.
Back in the day, land was the primary source of wealth, so those who controlled the land had a lot of power over those who worked it.
They were like mini kings within their own domains.
Pretty much. And the king's authority was often limited within these territories because he didn't have the direct means to enforce laws or collect taxes without the cooperation of these powerful landowners.
So it was a very decentralized power structure, with economic power being the foundation for political influence.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about financing wars, which has always been a major challenge for rulers throughout history.
Smith contrasts the difficulties of funding foreign wars by exporting raw materials versus manufactured goods. Why is that distinction so important?
He argues that it's much harder to sustain long and expensive wars by just exporting raw materials. You'd need a massive surplus beyond what your own population needs, and most countries simply don't have that.
Plus, the logistics of transporting all those raw materials overseas would be a nightmare.
Exactly. Exporting manufactured goods is more efficient because the labor involved stays at home, and only the surplus value embodied in the finished product is sent abroad.
It's like selling a finely crafted sword instead of a pile of iron ore. You're getting more bang for your buck in terms of the value you're exporting.
And Smith points to the historical struggles of English monarchs to finance long wars because they didn't have a lot of readily exportable manufactured goods beyond basic necessities.
They were more focused on agriculture and raw materials than on developing sophisticated industries.
And in less commercially developed societies, rulers often amassed large hoards of treasure as a kind of emergency fund for times of war or crisis.
It was like their rainy day fund, their way of preparing for the unexpected when they couldn't easily raise money through taxes or borrowing.
But in more commercially active nations, while rulers could potentially tap into the greater wealth of their subjects, they also tended to be more prone to extravagant spending, making the accumulation of large treasures less likely.
It's a trade-off. You have greater potential resources, but you also have more temptations to spend them.
Now let's delve into the mercantile system, which was a dominant economic philosophy for centuries.
And Smith was not a fan of this system, was he?
Not at all. He saw it as a collection of misguided policies that ultimately hindered economic growth.
So what was the basic idea behind the mercantile system?
The core belief was that a nation's wealth was measured by its stock of gold and silver.
So it was all about accumulating precious metals.
And they believed the best way to do this was to maintain a positive balance of trade, meaning exporting more goods than you import.
So the idea was to bring more gold and silver into the country than you send out.
Exactly. And to achieve this, they advocated for all sorts of government interventions like tariffs, subsidies, and even outright bans on imports.
It was all about protecting domestic industries and limiting competition from foreign goods.
And this led to all sorts of problems, including trade wars between nations, smuggling, and artificially high prices for consumers.
Smith argued that this focus on national self-interest was ultimately harmful to everyone involved. He believed that free trade, even with countries that were seen as rivals, was far more beneficial in the long run.
He saw trade as a way for nations to specialize in what they were good at producing and to exchange those goods for things they couldn't produce as efficiently themselves. It was a win-win situation.
Now let's talk about the Corn Laws, which were a set of policies designed to protect British agriculture.
The Corn Laws were a classic example of the kind of protectionist policies that Smith opposed.
They imposed high tariffs on imported grain, which kept the price of grain artificially high in Britain.
And this benefited landowners and farmers, but it hurt consumers, especially the poor, who had to pay more for their basic food staples.
Smith argued that this was a misguided policy because it didn't actually increase the real wealth of the nation. It just transferred wealth from consumers to producers.
He believed that the free market was the best way to determine the price of grain, and that government intervention only distorted the market and created inefficiencies.
So it's another example of how well-intentioned government policies can sometimes have unintended negative consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, let's touch on a few more specific taxes and regulations that Smith discusses, starting with salt taxes, which were a big deal in Britain.
I remember reading about how complex and convoluted the salt tax system was.
It was a mess. They had different tax rates for domestically produced salt versus imported salt, and there were all sorts of special rules for different industries, like the herring fishery.
It sounds like a bureaucracy gone wild.
It was. And Smith uses this as an example of how government intervention can create these tangled and often inefficient systems that end up costing more than they're worth.
He also discusses the history of laws regulating the export of corn, which went back and forth between restrictions and bounties.
It was a lot of trial and error, with policymakers constantly trying to find the right balance between the interests of producers, consumers, and the overall economy.
It's a reminder that economic policy is a complex beast and that there are rarely easy answers.
Now let's shift gears to coinage and bullion. Smith makes the point that the amount of new coins minted each year doesn't necessarily represent a net increase in the total money supply.
Because old coins are constantly being taken out of circulation due to wear and tear or melting down.
Exactly. And he also explains why worn or debased coins often circulate at the same face value as new coins, even though they might contain less actual metal.
Because in everyday transactions, people don't have the time or the inclination to weigh every coin and calculate its intrinsic value.
It's more about convenience than precision in those everyday exchanges.
But this can sometimes lead to the market price of bullion, the raw metal, exceeding the official mint price.
Because people are willing to pay a premium for the guaranteed purity and weight of the bullion. They know they're getting exactly what they pay for.
All right, let's talk about colonial trade, which was a major driver of economic growth for European powers.
Smith compares the approaches of